Hi students, welcome to HSC Earth and Environmental Science and Module 8, Resource Management. This is video number 3. We're going to have a little bit of a look at renewable energy sources. Our goal is to identify Australian renewable resources and where they are located, including but not limited to energy sources. So far we've had a look at agriculture and water, and this time we want to try and focus in a little bit on renewable energy. Remember, what we're talking about now is we're talking about resource management, and it's much easier to manage resources if we're using renewable resources. That is, resources that are going to continue to be replenished, certainly in our lifetimes. One of the problems with non-renewable resources is they take such a long time to form that we can't wait for things like coal or even gold and diamond deposits to reform in the Earth's crust. We can't rely on those long term. They are a finite resource, they will run out. But renewables resources are ones that are going to continue to be renewed, replenished and cycle. And so wind power, energy from the sun, biomass, and energy from the force of moving water, as well as things like geothermal, may well be sources that we can continue to tap into, and which we have in fact been tapping into over recent years in particular, to try and shift some of our reliance for energy generation away from non-renewables like coal and onto more of these renewable resources like wind, the sun and water. So when we're talking about this particular point, we need to talk about some of the actual applications of some of these different types of resources in these different areas. And you can see the little shift that's been happening, particularly over about the last decade, as we've continued to understand a little bit more about renewable resources, as we've also continued to expand our data sets on climate science and understand how we're all going to benefit from a shift towards more renewable energy sources for our energy generation. So this is a nice little graphic, and it's one of these ones that you want to be spending a little bit of time trying to interpret. So what makes a graph like this a little bit tricky is because there's all these different colors as we come over to the right-hand side of this particular graph, which is close to where we are now, and try and make some sense out of what we see. You can see that the kind of levels of hydroelectricity or water-generated energy have been reasonably consistent over time. There's some small fluctuations, but we've had a reasonably good history in terms of hydroelectric generation with things like the Snowy Mountains scheme. You'll see that this kind of an area we've had a little bit of understanding about for some time, and we've continued to take advantage of this source of energy generation. But what's been really interesting is the huge jump we've seen. And on this right-hand side of the graph, you can see there's been a massive increase in the amount of energy that's being generated, almost exclusively based on hydro in 1994-95. But now hydro makes up a very small, what's that, probably a quarter, maybe a third of the total generation. In fact, if we look at raw values, you're looking at about 15,000 gigawatt hours compared to a total of over 60, maybe 65 gigawatt hours. So our reliance on hydro has gone down. We've got wind. So look at the color schemes to see that wind. So this section here is wind power, and it's really increased. You can see that it doesn't even appear on this graph until about here. And then as it starts to increase, we realize that we're being able to produce it more effectively, more efficiently, and it's continued to rise. Bioenergy, again, has kicked in from fairly early, but hasn't really taken off. So when we look over at the right-hand side of our graph, it's still a small proportion of the total energy generation from renewables that can be linked back to bioenergy. But the other one that we are seeing, and you only have to take a drive around your local neighborhood and look up at the roofs, you'll see that the uptake of solar is increasing. And this makes sense in a country like Australia, where we've got so much of the sun falling on our land surface, to be able to take advantage of that solar energy and to turn that into some sort of electric generation that we can then use or we can move from one place to another just makes sense. Generation from renewables has increased by 126% over the past decade. And for those of us who have some concerns about what's happening to the climate in terms of the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, that's a very heartening sign. That's something that tells us that we're on the track and we just need to continue to do better and better as we go along. What has been interesting is the money, the research, and the increased efficiencies that are associated with some of these important renewable resources, and also the fact that we want to try and see where our newer technologies, which is going into things like solar and wind, are in expanding their proportion of our energy generation, and things like hydroelectric are older technologies and starting to kind of decline a little bit in how much we're making use of these types of energy sources. But the bottom line is we need to identify where these renewable energy sources are and what's actually happening in our country. So if we look at some figures, the latest ones that I could find were from 2020, so it's not too long ago. It gives us a bit of a picture of what we've got happening here. And these are government websites. So we always have our suspicions around what government is reporting on. But when you cross-reference these with other values, they seem pretty close to me. So I'm happy to go with these. In 2020, 24% of Australia's total electric generation was from renewable energy sources. That's almost a quarter. And that's a pretty impressive increase from what we did have. The major areas, as we talked about, are solar, wind, and also hydro, which is still in there and I guess kicking away as one of our sources of renewable energy generation. But these levels are the highest on record since about the mid-1960s. So we are trying to respond to this issue of renewable energy generation. Solar generation increased by about 27% in 2020 and by an average of about 28% per year over the last decade. Wind, likewise, not quite as big an increase, 16% in 2020 and about 14% on average year in, year out over the past decade. And these two sources in particular, solar and wind, have more than doubled renewable energy generation expansion over the last decade. These two sources have been significantly responsible. And it makes sense. We know that there are a lot of areas, a lot of coast around Australia, a lot of areas where we get high levels of sunlight, and also areas where we do get a reasonable amount of wind. Of course, the arguments against these are always the sun isn't always out, it's nighttime, the wind isn't always blowing, it's inconsistent. But we're realizing that there are ways where we can take advantage of the times when we are getting these resources to store some of that energy in battery packs and to be able to continue to release that energy at times where perhaps we're not getting quite as much light or wind. Hydropower output has fluctuated around a fairly consistent level, and you saw that on the graph that we looked at previously. But as these other areas have started to rise, it's started to fall back. So you see, if we go back and have a look at that previous graph, we saw about 1994 was the sort of left extent of that particular graph. And almost all of our renewable energy source was hydropower. So that was the predominant, almost the only source of renewable energy generation back in 1994. And since then, it's kind of held and started to dip a little bit, and its overall level is starting to pale, certainly as a percentage of the total amount that we're producing from renewable energy sources. Large-scale solar generation has been rapidly expanding in recent years, and this is really probably a phenomena of only about the last 5 or 6 years where we've got huge uptake. So we've got popular support. That means that there's got to be an expenditure made in order to put solar panels up there. There's got to be an understanding of how these work. And I think there's sometimes levels of trust. In fact, there's advertisements on the radio that are targeted at people who don't understand necessarily exactly how their solar systems work or exactly how to get the most out of their solar systems. And so this is an area where I guess we're starting to educate ourselves, as well as be educated by the experts who are installing these systems, who are making sure that they run efficiently, and who in the long run are saving us money and also saving our environment as a result of the shift away from non-renewable resources for energy generation into renewables. It's definitely something that we want to have a little bit of a look at in a bit more detail, but we'll do that in class. Thanks for watching.